My best friend's sister accused me of getting her pregnant. My parents disowned me despite the evidence. But when the DNA test revealed the truth and they lost in court, they were left broken and now beg for forgiveness they'll never get. I'm 26 years old, work in digital marketing for a mid-sized company, and I need to tell this story because it basically destroyed my relationship with my parents and almost ruined my entire life. The thing is, it all started like 2 years ago, when my best friend's sister Jenny accused me of getting her pregnant, and even though it sounds like cheap soap opera drama, I swear it's real, and it was way worse than you can imagine. I guess I should start by explaining the context a bit, so you understand why everything got so out of control. I grew up in a small town, one of those places where everyone knows everyone, and gossip flies faster than anything else. My parents are traditional, very religious, the type that goes to church every Sunday and believes family reputation is basically the most important thing in the world. They always raised me with very strict values about responsibility, honor, all those things that sound good in theory, but can turn against you when people judge you without listening to you first. My best friend Dave and I have known each other since elementary school. We literally grew up together, and his sister Jenny was always a bit odd, you know what I mean? Not in a bad way, just that she had her issues, like mental health problems that the family never fully wanted to acknowledge. Sometimes she'd have episodes where she'd say weird things or behave erratically, and Dave had told me privately that Jenny had been in therapy several times but never finished treatment. The truth is, I never had a close relationship with Jenny. Like, we were acquaintances because I spent a lot of time at Dave's house. But we weren't friends or anything like that. She was 3 years younger than us, always kind of quiet when we were around. And honestly, I didn't think much about her. Everything was normal in my life. I had a decent job, hung out with my friends on weekends, was considering going back to school for a master's degree. Nothing special, but I was happy, I guess. And then one day out of nowhere, like 2.5 years ago, Jenny calls me on the phone. I didn't even know she had my number, and she tells me she needs to talk to me urgently. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop because she sounded really upset and I thought maybe something had happened with Dave or their family. When I got there, she was sitting at a table in the back with red eyes, like she'd been crying. And before I could even sit down properly, she drops on me. "I'm pregnant and the baby is yours." Literally just like that, no preamble or anything. I stood there like an idiot, trying to process what I'd just heard because it made no sense. I told her, "Jenny, that's impossible. We've never had anything. We haven't even kissed." And she started insisting that yes, we had been together at a party like 3 months ago. The problem is, I wasn't even in the state 3 months ago. I was in California for work for almost 6 weeks straight. I had the plane tickets, hotel receipts, everything. I tried to explain that to her, but she got hysterical, started screaming that I was lying and that I had to take responsibility. People in the cafe were staring at us and I felt horrible, didn't know what to do. I suggested we go with Dave to talk all together, thinking maybe he could calm her down or help me reason with her. But Jenny got up and ran out of the place. I stayed there, sitting completely in shock, my heart beating a mile a minute, thinking what the hell just happened. I called Dave that same night and told him everything, and he was quiet for a long time before telling me that Jenny had had similar episodes before. Not about pregnancies, but inventing situations or misinterpreting events, and that she was probably having another breakdown. He said he was going to talk to her and their parents, and I thought that would be the end of it, that everything would get cleared up and we could move on with our lives. But no, things got worse. Turns out Jenny really was pregnant. That part was true, but she kept insisting I was the father. Dave told me he'd suggested she get a prenatal paternity test, one of those where they can do it with a blood sample from the mother without any risk to the baby. But Jenny flat out refused. She said it was dangerous for the baby, which is a lie because those types of tests are completely safe, and that she didn't need any test because she knew with certainty that I was the father. I was starting to seriously stress out because the situation made no sense. And then Dave told me that Jenny had been seeing several guys around that time and that probably one of them was the real father, but for some reason she'd fixated on me as the responsible one. I thought everything would stay there, within Dave and his family's circle, but turns out no. Like a month after that conversation at the cafe, my parents called me on a Sunday morning and told me they needed to talk to me urgently. I went to their house, and they were sitting in the living room with those serious faces they make when something's really wrong, and my father dropped on me. "We found out you got Dave's sister pregnant and you're refusing to take responsibility." I froze. I asked them who told them that, and turns out Jenny had gone to talk to them directly, crying and telling them her whole version of the story. A version where I was a monster who had used her and was now abandoning her and the baby. I tried to explain the truth to them, showed them the plane tickets, explained that I wasn't even in the state when the conception supposedly happened, told them everything about Jenny's problems and that she'd refused to take the prenatal test. But my parents didn't believe me. My mother told me that a woman wouldn't lie about something like this, that it was obvious Jenny was desperate and needed help, and that I was being a coward by refusing to accept the consequences of my actions. My father was even harsher, told me I was deeply disappointing him, that they'd raised me better than this, and that if I didn't do the right thing, they were going to have to reconsider their relationship with me. What followed were weeks of constant calls, messages, emails, my parents basically harassing me to accept paternity and marry Jenny, or at least give her financial support. I kept explaining the same thing over and over, that it was impossible for me to be the father, that I had proof, that Jenny needed psychological help, but it was like talking to a wall. My parents were completely convinced I was lying, and worst of all, they started telling other family members, their friends from church, basically anyone who would listen, that their son was an irresponsible person who had abandoned a pregnant girl. My reputation in town started getting destroyed. People looked at me weird at the grocery store. Some acquaintances stopped talking to me. It was a nightmare. Finally, after months of this torture, I told my parents I was willing to take a paternity test as soon as the baby was born. That would prove once and for all that I wasn't the father and that all this drama had been unnecessary. I thought that would calm them down a bit, but instead my father told me, "If you're so sure it's not yours, then why don't you take responsibility anyway and help that poor girl?" I can't explain how betrayed I felt in that moment, like nothing I said mattered, like they'd decided I was guilty regardless of evidence. I told them no, that I wasn't going to take responsibility for a child that wasn't mine just to save face or make them feel better. And that's when my father told me, "Then you're no longer welcome in this house. You're no longer my son." Just like that. My own parents disowned me for refusing to accept paternity of a child I knew 100% wasn't mine. I left that house, and honestly, I don't really remember how I got to my apartment. I was on autopilot, feeling like someone had repeatedly kicked me in the stomach. Dave tried to mediate, talked to my parents several times, explaining that Jenny had problems and that I was telling the truth, but they didn't want to listen to him. They said he was defending me because he was my friend and that he was being blind to my faults. The following months were horrible. I wasn't talking to my parents. I'd lost contact with several relatives who had taken their side, and at work I was constantly distracted and stressed about the whole situation. But I held on to one thing. The truth was going to come out when that baby was born and the paternity test was done. That was the only thing that kept me sane during that awful time. Finally, the baby was born. It was a girl, and I immediately requested through a lawyer that a mandatory paternity test be done. Jenny and her parents couldn't refuse because it was a court order. The process took like 2 weeks, which were the longest 2 weeks of my life. And when the results came, the lawyer called me and told me in a very professional voice, 0% probability of paternity. You are definitely not the father. I felt such great relief that I literally started crying right there in my office. I had to lock myself in the bathroom because I couldn't stop. It wasn't joyful relief exactly. It was more like relief that finally the nightmare was going to end, that I was going to be able to show everyone that I'd been telling the truth all along. I sent the test results to my parents by email with a very simple note that said, "Here's proof I never lied." I expected an immediate apology, expected them to come to my apartment begging forgiveness, expected something. What happened was silence for 3 full days, and then my mother called me crying, saying she was so sorry, that they'd made a terrible mistake, that please forgive them. My father got on the phone and also apologized, but there was something in his tone. I don't know. Like there was still a but there. You know what I mean? Like he was apologizing, but not completely. I told them I needed time to process everything, that I couldn't just forgive and forget after they'd treated me so horribly for almost a year, after they'd disowned me as a son for telling the truth. My mother started crying harder, saying that family was the most important thing and that we had to get over it. And my father added that they were going to compensate me, that they were going to give me money to help with the legal expenses I'd had. I told them I didn't want their money, that what I wanted was a real apology, for them to acknowledge the damage they'd done not just to me but to my reputation, my mental health, everything. But instead, my father got upset and told me I was being dramatic, that they'd acted in good faith believing what a scared pregnant girl had told them, and that I should understand their position. And that's when I realized they were never going to truly understand what they'd done to me, that in their heads they'd been victims of the situation as much as I was. Or maybe more because their reputation had also been tarnished when the truth came out. I decided I needed distance, cut contact for a while, didn't answer their calls or messages, and tried to rebuild my life. I thought eventually things would calm down, that Jenny would disappear from my life and everything would return to some kind of normal. But no, because Jenny apparently wasn't done causing problems. Like 2 months after the test results came out, Mike, a friend from high school who still lived in town, called to warn me that Jenny was going around saying I'd faked the test results, that I'd paid the lab or something so it would come out negative. The story was completely ridiculous. DNA paternity tests don't work like that. You can't just bribe a court-certified laboratory to change results. But people who wanted to believe the drama started repeating those rumors. And the worst part is that my parents, instead of publicly defending me, stayed silent. They didn't say anything to correct those rumors, didn't tell people the results were legitimate, basically left me alone to defend myself. That's when I started getting really angry. It wasn't just sadness or disappointment anymore, it was pure rage. I'd proven my innocence with irrefutable scientific evidence, and there were still people trying to destroy my name, and my own parents weren't doing anything to help me. I decided I didn't owe them anything. That if they weren't going to be on my side after everything that had happened, then I simply didn't need them in my life. I blocked their numbers, blocked their emails, blocked all possible contact. But they didn't accept that. They started some kind of campaign to contact me through other people. They wrote to several of my friends, asking them to convince me to talk to them. Contacted my cousin Melissa, who lives in another city, and who I'd always gotten along well with, even called my ex-girlfriend Samantha, who I hadn't seen in years. All these people were writing to me saying my parents were desperate to talk to me and to please reconsider my position. It was exhausting. I couldn't escape them even by cutting off direct contact. And then something happened that definitely crossed the line. My parents called my workplace. They told my boss they were worried about my mental health, that I'd been acting erratic and needed help, basically trying to make it seem like I was unstable. My boss, who fortunately is a reasonable person, called me into his office and asked what was going on. I explained the whole situation to him, showed him the paternity test results, everything, and he was very understanding. He told me my parents had no right to call my workplace and that if it happened again, he was going to have to take legal action against them. But the damage was done. Several coworkers had found out that my parents had called and started speculating about what was happening. It was humiliating. That was enough for me. I hired Robert, a lawyer specialized in these types of situations, and requested a restraining order against my parents. The process was relatively quick, because I had documentation of all their contact attempts, the calls to my work, everything. The judge approved the order, and my parents were notified that they couldn't contact me directly or indirectly, couldn't approach my home or work, basically had to stay completely away from my life. You'd think that would be the end, but no. Like a month after the restraining order, I went out one morning to go to work and found my car vandalized. Someone had keyed the word liar into the driver's door with a key or something. The damage was deep and obvious. I filed a police report, but there were no cameras in my building's parking lot, and there was no way to prove who'd done it. I had my obvious suspicions, but suspecting isn't the same as proving. I had to pay like $800 to get the car's paint fixed. It was another expense on a long list of expenses related to all this drama. Weeks passed without more incidents, and I started thinking my parents had finally gotten the message. But then I received legal documents. My parents were suing me for emotional damages and psychological stress. The lawsuit was basically insane. They alleged I defamed them by publicly accusing them of treating me badly. that the restraining order had caused embarrassment in their community, and that I owed them compensation for all the suffering I'd caused them. Robert, my lawyer, read the lawsuit and told me it was one of the most ridiculous things he'd seen in his career, that it had no solid legal basis, but we still had to respond and probably go to court. The legal process was exhausting and expensive. We had to compile all the evidence again, get testimonies from Dave, from my boss, from other people who could verify my version of events. Meanwhile, my parents hired a lawyer who apparently was charging them a ton of money to pursue this futile case. We got to court like 6 months after they filed the lawsuit, and the judge heard both sides. My lawyer presented all the evidence, the paternity test results, records of my parents' calls to my work, documentation of the restraining order. Everything was there in black and white. The judge basically dismissed my parents' case in a matter of minutes. He said it was evident that I had been the victim in this whole situation, that my parents had acted inappropriately by not believing in my innocence despite the evidence, and that their lawsuit not only lacked merit but seemed to be another harassment attempt. He ordered them to pay my legal costs, which ended up being like $12,000, an amount I know hurt them because they're not exactly rich. I left that courtroom feeling a mix of relief and sadness, because yes, I'd won. But in the end, I'd had to take my own parents to court to get them to leave me, alone. After the trial, I expected them to finally understand they'd been wrong, that all this had gone too far. But instead, my mother told Melissa, my cousin, that I'd publicly humiliated them in court and that I was an ungrateful son. Melissa told me this because she's on my side and thinks my parents have gone crazy, but it still hurt to hear it. There was no trace of real remorse on their part, no acknowledgement that they'd been the ones who caused all this by not believing me from the beginning. Like 3 months ago, Melissa called to tell me my parents were planning a big family reunion, like for Christmas or something, and that apparently the idea was to force some kind of reconciliation with me. They were going to invite all the aunts and uncles, cousins, practically the entire extended family, and then invite me, expecting I couldn't say no in front of everyone. It was a classic manipulative move, you know, using social and family pressure to force me to forgive and forget. I told Melissa to let them know I wasn't going under any circumstances, and that if they sent me the invitation, I was going to ignore it completely. Sure enough, like 2 weeks later, I received an email from my mother with all the reunion details, written in a super casual tone, as if nothing had happened, as if there weren't restraining orders and lawsuits involved. The email ended with something like, "We hope to see you there. It would be nice to have the whole family together again." I didn't respond. I left the email sitting there unanswered because I didn't owe them even that. Some relatives started writing to me, asking if I was going, subtly pressuring me with things like, "Your parents miss you so much," or "It would be good if you tried to fix things." And I had to explain to several of them, with more patience than I felt, that I wasn't going to fix anything with people who had treated me like garbage for a year and a half and who had never given a real apology. The reunion was like a month ago. I didn't go, obviously. Melissa told me afterwards that my parents spent the whole event with long faces, telling whoever would listen that their son had abandoned them, that they didn't understand what they'd done wrong. According to Melissa, several relatives told them maybe they should reflect on their actions, but my parents only said they'd done what any parent would do in that situation. That phrase, "what any parent would do," makes me so angry because no, it's not what any parent would do. A real parent would have believed their son when he presented evidence of his innocence. A real parent would have been on my side when the test results proved I'd been telling the truth all along. 2 weeks ago, my mother found a way to technically bypass the restraining order without violating it. She sent me a physical letter to my apartment, not email or call, just an old-school letter. I opened it without thinking, and it was basically a long plea for me to reconsider my position, that they'd made mistakes but had done so from love, that family was more important than pride. It didn't mention at any point the specific damage they'd caused me. There was no real apology for disowning me or calling my work or suing me, just generalities about mistakes and family love. I threw it in the trash and sent a final email through my lawyer, making clear that any additional contact attempts would result in more legal action. Today, I live my life completely separate from my parents. I don't talk to them, don't know what they're doing, and honestly don't care. Dave and I are still friends, though our relationship changed a bit because of all this, but he understands my position and respects my decision. Jenny, according to what I found out from Dave, eventually admitted who the baby's real father was, some guy she'd been briefly seeing, and now they're trying to co-parent or something. My parents never offered me an apology for believing her from the start, for doubting me, even when I presented proof. Last week, I was at the grocery store and saw my mother in one of the aisles. She saw me too, and for a second I thought she was going to approach, but I simply turned around and went in the opposite direction. I didn't feel like a dramatic encounter in public, didn't feel like hearing more excuses or pleas. When I got to my car, I realized my hands were shaking a little. Not from fear, but from the tension of the whole situation. And I sat there for a few minutes, breathing deeply before driving home. It's weird how your body reacts to these things even when mentally you know you made the right decision. I don't know if I'll ever forgive my parents. People tell me all the time that life is short, that family is important, all those cliched phrases that are supposed to make you feel guilty for maintaining boundaries. But the truth is, what they did to me wasn't a small mistake or misunderstanding. They disowned me when I needed them most, destroyed my reputation, harassed my workplace, and then when I had to defend myself legally, they sued me for it. There's no coming back from all that, at least not for me. Maybe I'm vindictive. Maybe I should be the bigger person and forgive, but I can't. I don't want to. My life now is calmer without them. I work, hang out with friends. I'm considering moving to another city to start completely fresh. Sometimes I feel guilty for not feeling worse about the situation, but then I remember everything that happened and the guilt disappears. I chose my peace of mind over maintaining a toxic relationship with people who proved they didn't trust me, even when I had all the evidence on my side. And I guess that's okay. Or at least it has to be, because it's the only way I can move forward.